Hello, I'm Wayne from TorqueCars. The busiest section on our site is all about adding power to the car. So we're going to look at the best ways to do that. Keep watching to the end to find a couple of areas that people often overlook, but unless they're addressed, it doesn't matter how much power you've added, you just won't get the benefit of that extra performance of the car. We'll also break down the power gains for individual mods and see what happens when you combine these together. So the basic principle of tuning a car is to get the car to burn more fuel. If you can get more fuel to burn, you will make more power. So you need to match the fuel and air very, very precisely. So with tuning, you're looking to increase the supply of air to the engine and also the supply of fuel to match that. So the most common mods that people typically start with is the exhaust, which theoretically allows the air to flow out of the engine more quickly, and also the intake, which allows the engine to suck in more air without a restriction. But generally those two mods will not do very much on most cars that we see. So you're wasting your time if you just add those mods and expect a power gain. But you have set the car up nicely to have a power hike because those two areas are typically the ones where you'll hit the most restriction. So once you've addressed the airflow through the engine, there's a whole load of other mods that you can start to do. So the most common ones that people do is get a remap done, which changes the whole timing of the engine and allows the engine to see the extra air and the extra fuel, and will increase the power, change the duration of the spark and the timing. And if you've got a turbo engine, you can really see some big power gains just by having a remap done. The modern ECU or car computer can actually control the turbo and the amount of air that flows into the engine. If you don't have a turbo engine, then you're looking at getting a fast road cam, which is the biggest power gain you can get to the engine. But with most mods, you're adding power further up the RPM range. So you'll see a higher peak of power, and sometimes you might even see lower bottom end power. So you really need to look at how you're going to use the car and decide where you actually want that power ratio to be. If you're going to the track, then you want it all at the top end in the high RPM band. If you're using your car every day for travelling to work, you need to think about using the car for everyday traffic and driving on that daily commute. So the camshaft actually alters the opening and closing of the valve. So the camshaft has little egg-shaped lobes on it, and as it rotates, it will allow those valves for the intake and the exhaust to open and close. So by changing the timing of those, you can actually make fairly substantial differences to the characteristics and nature of the engine. But if the cam profile is too aggressive, you'll actually suffer from a very rough idle and tick over, and the car will be quite lumpy and challenging to drive in traffic. We've said that you need to get more fuel into the engine, so the fuel system, the injectors and the fuel pump that supplies the fuel needs to be sufficient. Most factory fit equipment is reasonably good at dealing with a 20 to 30% power hike. In some cases you can get away with more. In a few cases it would even struggle to reach those additional power figures. But making sure that those primary components can flow enough fuel into the engine is really critical. If we don't do that, we end up with flat spots and hesitancy, or the car might stall. The remap is always best done last, because it ties together all of the other mods. Now the map is actually, think of it as a table like you'd get in a spreadsheet, and it tells the engine how much fuel and air to burn and how to burn it, depending on how fast the engine is going and whether the engine is under a load if you're pressing the accelerator or not. The modern ECU is making thousands and thousands of decisions. We've done separate videos looking in depth at ECUs and remapping and tuning the ECU. So skip over to one of those other videos if you want an in-depth look at remapping. There are some models of car with a locked ECU where you can't add a remap to it. So you've got a couple of options there. You could potentially get an aftermarket ECU which completely replaces the factory ECU and accepts whatever programming you need. And in many cases they're far more advanced and operate at faster speeds than the car's standard ECU. Or you can get a piggyback ECU which sits between your car's ECU and the components in the engine. and it will basically take readings from one and lie to the other in order to maximize the power, to maybe increase the fuel, increase the air. Now, a word of warning, there's a lot of very cheap tuning boxes. You can usually identify them because they have just one connection, and that one connection generally just dumps more fuel. It increases the fuel rail pressure. You will get more power, but often it's smoky, and just dumping more fuel in can cause all sorts of other problems, notably build up in the engine, and this all builds up over time, creating a problem further down the line. So it really is a false economy, and sadly some expensive tuning boxes are little more than one of these little resistors that just adjust the fuel rail pressure in order to make more power. So be very careful, ask around, get reviews, look at our website at some of the reviews that we've done and things that our members are saying about these different options, and that way you can avoid many of the pitfalls and problems that come along with that. In most cases, the remap is the biggest power gain that you'll get, especially if you've got a turbocharged engine. If you've got a naturally aspirated engine, as we said just now, the camshaft is usually your best bet if you want to see a power gain. So if you've got a naturally aspirated engine, you could add a turbocharger to it. Now, in the computer games, it's very easy. You just click a box and suddenly your little car has got a turbo and it's making another 200-300 brake horsepower. In the real world, it doesn't really work like that. There are very few engines that you can bolt a turbo on and they will work happily. The compression ratio of the engine needs to be right. If that compression ratio is too high, the engine will suffer from detonation and pre-ignition, and you get all sorts of problems and difficulties, and the car will just not run. In a lot of cases, the airflow meter cannot cope with the additional air that the turbo is pushing in, and the car will either go into limp home mode or just not start at all. So there's a lot of issues to be addressed if you are fitting a turbocharger. Your best bet is to source a kit where someone's done all of the research for you and they've got an ECU setup program that you can just drop into your ECU, and all the ancillary components that allow the turbo to be bolted onto the engine, that supply the turbo with a feed of oil to keep it well lubricated, and even fitting an intercooler to take the intake temperature back down after the turbo has done its work and compressed the air. So internal engine mods are probably the way to go to fit a turbo, so you can get an opportunity to lower the compression ratio of the engine. Manufacturers have also added direct injection, which is another way of avoiding the problem of ignition, where the fuel is injected directly into the cylinders so the pressure buildup doesn't cause pre-ignition. So are we just limited to a remap? Well, if your car has already got a turbo, are there any upgrade options available to you? Well, yes, larger turbos. There's a few options open to us. The most popular and easy one to install is a hybrid turbo, where a standard turbo casing is taken and the internals are stripped out and you replace them with uprated internals that can make more power. You can change the spool up characteristic or maybe raise the power band to the top end of the RPM range. The other option is just going with a larger turbo. If you buy this as a kit, you'll often get a manifold that can just bolt onto your engine, so they make it quite easy. But sometimes you'll get a larger turbo and you will need to adjust the pipework in the engine and all the connections in order to get it to fit and work properly. But that is a good way to get the really big power gains. But bear in mind, the factory injectors and the factory fuel pump can only push out so much fuel. If they do not supply enough fuel for this large amount of air coming into the engine, you'll get flat spots, the engine's going to throw error codes, you'll get warning lights on your dashboard, the car may even go into limp home mode and the power will be dramatically reduced. So you really do need to over specify your turbo and your injectors to make sure you've still got a little bit of leeway, because as those components get older, their performance will degrade. And if your car is tuned and set up assuming everything is going to work at its optimum efficiency, as soon as it drops a little bit, you're going to have all sorts of problems. So like the manufacturers, we need to build in a little bit of slack that age and wear and tear will take up. Now let's talk about handling. One of the most significant things you can do to a car is improve its handling. Even if you've got a small car that's not very powerful, there's a lot you can do to increase its cornering and the way it handles. So the first thing we would always say is try and reduce the weight of the car. In your boot or trunk, depending on which part of the world you're from, don't store junk. Maybe even take out the spare wheel and anything that's adding weight to the car. If you can save weight, you gain power effectively. Your car will accelerate more quickly, and it will certainly improve the handling. So whatever you can do to reduce the weight, please do so. We see people going to the extremes of adding perspex windows, fiberglass panels, and even carbon fiber panels and carbon fiber bonnets. They can all offer significant weight reductions. So once you've reduced the weight, it's time to think about the actual suspension. Now, the generally accepted urban myth is that the car needs to be as low as possible on really hard suspension. Now that might work on an F1 car on a racetrack, but on a road car you're dealing with potholes, undulations and all sorts of imperfections in the road surface. So if your car is really low on really hard springs, it's going to bounce. And you want your car tyres to be in contact with the road surface as much as possible and to smooth out those transitions. Think carefully about the car and its setup from the factory. They're not too bad. Usually about 20-30 millimeters is all you need to drop to improve it, to lower that centre of gravity. If you can get coilovers or adjustable suspension, it means that you've got more flexibility. You can adjust the ride height and the suspension spring rates to suit your driving style and to suit your personal car. It makes a lot more sense to have something you can change and tweak and tune rather than just guess on a factory setup and put that on your car and hope it works. You might pay a little bit more for these adjustable suspension systems, but they really are worth the investment and they make a big difference. Now think as well about the geometry of the suspension. As the car turns, the weight will transition to one side of the car. In extreme cases, you may even lift up a wheel, effectively reducing your contact patch by a third. So you want to keep all four tyres on the road, you want to eliminate body roll, you want the suspension to line up with the road surface to maximise your grip by optimising the contact patch. So there's lots of different settings and we're not going to go too nerdy in this video. We're just going to talk about the basic principles of setting your suspension up. So the first setting is the toe. So if you stood up and looked down at your toes, if you angled your feet inwards, that would be toe in. And if you angled your feet outwards, like Charlie Chaplin, that would be toe out. Now that has quite a dramatic effect on a car's handling. So if you go for toe in, you get a lot more straight line stability. If you put toe out or bias it more outwards than it is inward, you'll improve the cornering of the car. While you're improving the cornering of the car, you're reducing the straight line stability and the car will be a little bit more twitchy. So there's a balancing act to perform here. It's not unheard of for people to get their car suspension set up depending on the track they go to. If there's a lot of fast corners, they'll get the suspension set up so they can get the best time through those fast corners. If it's a lot of very, very shallow corners and lots of straights, they'll get the suspension set up to give them the maximum speed through those straights and the maximum stability that they can get. So you've got to think about your suspension as a whole and the effect it's going to have on the car. It's always a compromise. Unless you've got a very complex computerized suspension system that will adjust those settings on the fly depending on what the car's doing, you're stuck with setting it up as best you can and living with it. So the other setting that people do is the camber. This is the angle of the wheel in relation to the road surface. So if the wheels are dead upright, you've got brilliant grip in a straight line. But as soon as you corner, the weight of the car and the roll will shift and you'll be on the edge of the tyre. So you'll be reducing your cornering grip. So by adding a little bit of camber, you've adjusted the way the suspension moves the tyres, and as the body rolls, the tyre contact patch goes flat with the road surface, maximising your grip. We've seen some really extreme camber setups. There's definitely a trend of stanced cars out there which take these things to the extreme, and the tyre is literally running on the very edge of the rim. That is not a performance mod. You're losing so much grip. It might look cool depending on the groups that you hang with, but in reality it will not improve the performance of the car even when cornering. So avoid those extremes and just think about getting the car set up properly. Most factory setups are adequate, but they can nearly always be improved, and some cars don't have the full range of adjustment, so you may need to fit a camber kit or get some aftermarket suspension components that will allow you to adjust all of these extra settings and really maximise the handling of your car. But when your car is moving faster, you need to think about stopping it. Braking is just as important as acceleration, so you must think carefully about doing a car project as a whole, not just putting a big engine in and making lots of power. You've got to set the handling up, you've got to get the braking right. So on a standard car, one of the easiest mods is just to change the brake pads. Choosing a pad with a higher friction material can make a big difference. We've seen shocking differences between pad manufacturers' products. Some of them are so hard they're dubbed as long life pads because they don't wear out. You kind of want your brake to work, to create friction, to wear out. Some pads generate an awful lot of dust, so that can be a pain keeping the alloy wheels clean and keeping everything tidy. There's a big difference as well in the operating temperatures. So on a track car, your brakes are going to be really hot most of the time. You'll be braking really hard into the corners, and you'll be doing that every 30-40 seconds depending on the track and setup, sometimes even more frequently than that. So you need a pad that can operate at extremely high temperatures. Most factory fit road pads will start to smoke and burn. We've even seen them catching fire when used on the track. So specifying a pad suitable for the use of the car is critical. But don't make the mistake of assuming you need a race pad on a road car, because the resistance of burning at the high temperature comes at a cost of low down efficiency when it's cold. And on a road car, your pads spend most of their time being cold, and you'll use them very occasionally, and they never get warm enough. They'll still stop the car. I've not seen a sports pad that didn't work on a road car, but it's not as effective, and you could argue it would make the car more dangerous. But outside of that, thinking about the brake disc itself, that's the huge metal disc that the pad clamps onto. So the job of that is to create heat between the pad and the disc. It's that heat that's sapping your momentum and slowing you up. So the bigger that disc is, the better it is. There's designs where you've got vented discs and grooved discs and drilled discs, and all of those aid with the cooling, but you can generally choose a bigger disc and better pads as long as you've got the space in your alloy wheel to fit and accommodate the new brakes. Now bear in mind that all the mods are cumulative. You may not see much power adding a sports exhaust or an induction kit, but when you've added both of those and you've done other mods, you get a lot more power from those other mods. We've actually got a table here that looks at the power gains of the individual components and the aggregate power gain, and it's interesting that that aggregate power gain is much larger than just adding the individual power gains for each of the mods. So tuning is very much holistic, and as you're moving the power band, the area in the RPM range that has the most peak power, you're actually changing the characteristics and nature of the car. So let's take a 160 horsepower turbocharged car as an example. If you add an induction kit, you might get another 5 horsepower. If you were to add a sports exhaust, that might give you 7 horsepower. Combining both, you net slightly more at 14 horsepower. If you were to upgrade the fueling system, you're unlikely to make more power unless the existing fueling system was particularly bad, but that's a good mod because it really adds to the potential power you get from the car. So we'll say 0 for fueling on its own. If you were to just remap the car, you may net a power increase of 61 horsepower. So adding those all together, we'll see a peak power gain of around 73 horsepower. But when you do all of the mods to the car, you see a net gain of 125 horsepower. So the benefits of all the mods together working together give you a much higher ceiling at the end of your tuning mods. So when you're buying things like light bulbs, you know that a 1000-watt bulb is going to be much brighter and better than 100-watt bulbs, but you can't apply that same logic to buying car tuning parts. The figures quoted are often peak power gains. They don't actually tell you what that does to the overall power band, which is a major consideration. You can end up creating a car that is only good at the top end of your RPM range, or it's only got low down power and it'll be no good for track days and driving competitively. So let's look at those commonly overlooked areas that if you forget about or don't address them, it doesn't matter how much power you add, you won't feel the benefit of it in your day-to-day drive. So you've added a lot more power and you've actually moved your power band to a different point in the RPM range, maybe even extending the RPM range. And if you make it very different, you may well have to look at your gear ratios. You don't want to have to change gear too early. You want your gear changes to match in with the power bands for smooth power deliveries. So we see a lot of people having to alter the gear ratios because the car is not very drivable with the extra power. You really need to look at the transmission and the engine as a holistic approach to tuning. Now think also about getting that power down. The clutch takes the power from the engine to the transmission to the tyres. If your clutch is slipping, that can cause all manner of problems and issues. So you want to make sure that you've got a good quality clutch that can cope with the extra torque that you're putting through the engine. And the tyres are really the only point of contact the car has with the road. So if your tyres are not gripping, it doesn't matter how much power you add, that will not translate into additional performance. So think very carefully about the type of tyres you fit and the dimension of the wheels and the compound that you use. We've got separate videos coming up that look in depth at tyres and how to choose a good tyre for your car. So stay subscribed if you don't want to miss out on those. So some of the other components within a car that can actually rob you of a little bit of power are often pollution controls. Now in most states and countries it's illegal to remove those pollution controls, but thankfully there are performance alternatives. You can get high flow sports catalysts. You can get particulate filters that are of a high flow nature, and many modern cars are fitted with 2 or 4 different catalysts. So changing the nature of those catalysts, maybe 1 high flow catalyst instead of the 2. It depends a lot on the actual car and the setup, but you can make fairly significant power gains just by optimizing the flow through these pollution control systems, and you'll still meet the emissions regulations, which is a win-win for everyone concerned. So we see a lot of people wasting money on mods, and the common issue that we come across is they've just not thought it through. They've gone to the shop, they've bought a part, they've fitted it to their car, maybe been a little bit disappointed with the power gains they've got, and then they've had to go through the process again and get another part, and maybe even replacing some of those earlier parts. So it really makes sense to sit down and think carefully about your project. How are you going to be using the car? Where do you want the power band? What's the most important thing to you? Do you need good fuel economy and efficiency? Or are you looking for the maximum track day performance? Because all of those things have a bearing on how the car is set up, and you will always compromise. Setting a car up is always a compromise between absolute power and comfort and efficiency. I know a lot of people have just thought, I just want the maximum performance. They fitted really hard springs, they've lowered the car, they've gone for the maximum power, aggressive cam profiles, etc. But the car has actually been undrivable in everyday traffic. It skips and bounces over all of the bumps. It's very hard to drive smoothly in the stop-start traffic. And I've had a lot of people email me and say that I've ruined my car, how can I sort it out? And the answer usually is to undo most of the mods that they've done, come up with a plan, and then apply those mods in order to the car in order to release the maximum amount of power. So we really hope this has been useful to you. Please subscribe. We've got lots more in-depth articles, and we're going to be doing some much more advanced stuff when it comes to car tuning. Stay tuned to TorqueCars to keep your car in peak performance. So thanks for watching. We hope this has been informative to you. Be sure to drop by our site, say hi to us in our forums.